Thank you, Marijn. Next speaker is, as you said, Professor Rob van Tulder. And he's the Professor of International Business Society Management. Rob van Tulder.
Does it work? Yes, it works. In 1988, I wrote together with a colleague of mine a book on European multinationals and core technologies. And it was the time that the American companies were ruling the world. And it was a surprising book because there were lots of European companies that were actually leading in the area, but that didn't show up in the statistics. So one of those companies was Bayer, and it still is there. So congratulations. I'm very happy also to be here to have a speech right after you, Marijn. The talk that I would like to give deals also with the issue that was just mentioned, stakeholder involvement, sustainability, leadership. And when we look at some of the leaders in the world, and for instance we take, and that is, yes, a leader called Paul Polman of Unilever that is considered to be the most sustainable manager in the world, he has an interesting statement. He says, we're the world's biggest NGO. And even worse, at least for NGOs, NGOs are a non-governmental organization. Of course, he's right, by the way, a firm is a non-governmental organization, at least in Europe. In China, that's a different story. He also said, the only difference is we're making money, so we're sustainable. Wow. So what about social enterprise then? But we have another statement here. That's, for instance, a leader of a big NGO. This is Plan International, and this is Monique van Hek. And she says, well, we need to invest in girls, and that's a solid investment. And by doing that, we also, if we're not doing that, we miss opportunities. We need the skills of women, girls first. And they ally then with big companies. Or when I go to the other side, and I see what Prime Minister Rutte this weekend said in the New York meeting of the United Nations, well, says we learned from our experience in the past couple of years, and we cannot do it on our own. Actually, we have 3 lessons to learn. We have to work together. It should be done in multi-stakeholder involvement, and it should be in public-private partnerships. So these 3 statements hopefully make it clear that there is something really changing. Nobody can do it on their own. So what I call this the basic alignment challenge for the moment. So on the one hand, we have companies that come up with a value proposition. That's what you actually do, of course, adding and scaling value. We have NGOs. Let's call it NGOs. We, at the moment, tend to call them civil society organizations. I think that's also a more positive phrase than non-governmental. Creating and living value. And government should create the preconditions for value creation. So what about this alignment? And you might have seen also in the literature, this is my function also of today, to comment a little bit on the statement that was just said. What do we know about this? Well, there's a popular phrase that says we need to create shared value. This is what Michael Porter and Kramer has said. Now the problem there is, what does that mean, shared value? So there is one dimension to this that I can say, well, what are the issues that are material to companies, where you want to create value? The second part is, what are the issues that are material to society? And then the leadership challenge is basically how to overcome that in a timely manner. Luckily, we are at RSM, we have a long list of professors that know something about leadership. You see, I'm not there. There's one woman, Diane Beverland. Unfortunately, she's ill, so she couldn't be here. Otherwise, she would be in the center of our session. But we have lots of professors. 2 of them will also do it together today, Joep Cornelis and Lucas Meijs. But Kees van Dam, for instance, our newly appointed endowed chair of Amnesty International on international business and human rights, is also looking at leadership in the industry for human rights. Dirk van Dierendonk, Marius van Dijken, Daan van Knippenberg, and Stefan Giesner are all full professors on leadership. Now there is a problem. And because I'm not in the inner circle of the leadership circle, I hope you don't mind that I will say something about this. I just checked it with Dirk, by the way, he doesn't mind. this is the discourse that doesn't really help. That means we talk about transformational leaders, servant leaders, we talk about visionary leaders, ethical leaders, strategic leaders, autocratic leadership, and basically everything that is there, and there's more. So we could talk, and I could ask Marijn, for instance, well, what do you feel most comfortable with? And probably not one box, I hope. No, I'm sure not. So this is one of the things we try to establish, is get through this blocks of controversial themes and to make something out of that. So what do we know? Well, valuing leadership means it is really context dependent. And it was already mentioned, an American context really matters for the type of leadership that you can establish. A European context is different. It is also related to the phase that you're in. Are you a long-established company or a shortly established company? It really matters. And we tend to mix up. We tend to mix up the leader of a big established company like Bayer with a startup company or a venture capital company in the United States. And of course, the Bayer is a bureaucracy then. And the startup is a new sexy company. Well, what we would try to say is, well, go further than that. Look at the issues that they address. Look at the value proposition that they address. And it also shows that it is possible to combine leadership styles, leadership identities. By the way, we also know that there's a clear distinction between tall leaders and short leaders, and male and female. And if you really want to be lead, you have to go for the statistical height. That helps you a lot. So that's why Mr. Sarkozy in France or other leaders of undisputed reputation, like the North Korean leader, wear high heels. The only men in the world that wear high heels. Well, it's strongly related to the value proposition of companies. So that actually makes the leadership, and the legitimacy of the leader depends on how you can combine that also. What is your value proposition and the like? Now, leaders today have a problem. And this is a graph, it's not really well reproduced, but this is the Sustainability Leaders 2015 Scoreboard, and it says something about what is the performance of the leaders and who should lead. And then you might see that there is a problem there. The private sector is to the left, they should lead, but they're not doing that or not performing that. And governments are also declining there, but the decline actually means that we don't even expect governments to lead anymore, at least not to the extent that they did in the past. So, corporate leaders have a serious legitimacy problem, and you can look at trust barometers and the like. So there's not a criticism to leaders, maybe, but in any case, it's the perception of society. So what will be the challenge? One of the challenges we're looking at also is looking at what we call the value proposition of companies. And the financial crisis has shown us many, many things. And one of the things that it has shown us is that something that you might call a poor value proposition. And it's the value proposition that you will find in almost all the business books say, you have to go for an instrumental, simplistic value proposition like profit maximization or cost reduction, or your employees are just flex workers, or your strategic management is just being the biggest. Maybe you've seen some of the clips right before the financial crisis. There's a famous one as Barclays Bank, where Anthony Hopkins, a famous performer, has this clip, being big. And being big is good. And of course it's not. So one of the problems of the financial crisis has been too big to fail. And in scientific terms, we call that the moral hazard problem. But actually, if you look at the leadership problem, it is a bit the responsibility, the value proposition problem. So what we're looking at is how to make that rich, the value proposition. And there are lots of examples, and I just show you a few examples. You can just read it in the annual reports of companies. It's about not profit maximization, but enabling an environment for profits. Being an inspiring and a committed employer for committed staff. So then the question is, in what sense can you make then the issues around you material to you? Well, luckily, most of the companies in the world do it like this. There's what we call the materiality metrics. This is the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative metric, where you basically say, what is the material to you as a company and what is material to your stakeholders? and actually Marijn was also referring to that there also as a struggle of companies. So these are some examples of companies that try to bring in this materiality idea. Now, what do we know about how big corporations work with that? We did some research on this, and there are some booklets also you can look at. What we know, first of all, is that almost all companies in the world try to engage with their stakeholders. And they really are also engaging in partnering, and they're addressing the materiality question. And they also engage in stakeholder dialogues, and they try to develop mottos that actually try to show what kind of philosophy they have. Secondly, we also know that most of these presentations are quite reactive. Sometimes even the easy part of the story. It's supply-driven, the implementation is not guaranteed, and the stakeholders that are gathered around companies very often are the friendly ones. At least that's the general picture we have with these companies. So we still have the conclusion that there's still a lot of effort to be done or lots of improvement to be made. Now, finally, what does it mean for Bayer? And I asked Twan also to have a few minutes to apply it, what we just said, to the Bayer statement. So this is Bayer, science for a better life. And there's an easy part and there is a more difficult part to the statement. The easy part is science, the difficult part is better life. The easy part is the inside-out approach, the more difficult part is the outside-in or the interactive part, as was mentioned earlier. It's an alignment of cultures within the organization, and it's alignment of cultures outside of the organization. And you can see already we're talking about the real leadership issue there. And it leads then to things like the Live Leadership Project of Bayer, and it leads to what is material for primary stakeholders, what should you put in the leadership toolkit for your primary stakeholders or your secondary stakeholders. So I took one step further, also looking at what Bayer presents in their own annual reports. And what you see, this is the materiality index of Bayer. It is small print, but you see in the high segment, it's about product stewardship, innovation, business ethics, climate change, human rights. All very, very important issues that Bayer thinks is very material for themselves and for the stakeholders. Now in 2014, that's the last year, the materiality index or matrix becomes bigger even. I can only say this is sort of increased insights that is also represented in the annual report. Even to the extent that the high category now has been superseded by a very high, or what is it? Yes, a very high category. And it's becoming bigger. So the first conclusion you can draw from this is that Bayer is confronted with more issues. Or the second conclusion you can draw is that Bayer actually wants to confront itself with more issues. And I think both are right. One example, for instance, the access to medicine is an issue that is really on top of the attention of Bayer. But it's also partly because the Access to Medicine Index has been published in 2014, and Bayer didn't really come out well, for a variety of reasons. Maybe Marijn can say something about that. This is something where access to medicine for a big complex organization like Bayer is complex. But also stakeholder engagement and partnering was there, and it wasn't there a year earlier. So this is something where you could say counterfeit goes down, sustainable food supply goes up. What I'm trying to make the statement is here that looking at these materiality issues shows you what the dimensions and what the challenges for the leadership are. And just as a final remark on this, let's take the final upright segment of the leadership challenge. You can see what they are there. And now my statement to Marijn, also my invitation would be, wouldn't it be nice, and we are doing that with some of the big companies in the Netherlands also, if we could turn around this issue, make it from a supply-driven materiality index where you look at a number of the issues that you find important and some of your stakeholders find important, to a more demand-oriented materiality index where you don't switch issues too much every year on the basis of what actually comes into the media. So that's why the last weekend was nice, because in the last weekend we had the agenda set out for us for the next 15 years. These are the global goals, That's what Premier Rutte also was there. And I'm sure that if you look at those goals, these create a more positive frame for companies. That is something also what we are experimenting with a large number of big companies. Check out what kind of the global goals you would like to address, and there are many of them. And that creates, of course, a much more common frame and a much more positive frame also for the next 15 years. Now, I'm almost sure, but maybe call me naive, that Bayer is well positioned in those goals, but maybe we can talk about that later. So summarizing what should be in the toolkit of our leader, it should be a combination of roles, and I think on the basis also of the speech we just heard, it's a combination of those roles. It's not about transaction, it's not about being efficient, it is about thought leadership, visionary leadership, and the like. And the book then becomes how to smartly combine them in a timely fashion. How to manage a portfolio of partnerships that actually will also bring into your partnerships the more critical partners, because they will help you also define the more challenging issues. It is about shared value proposition, and it should be a positive frame, but flexible. So with that, I really am happy again to be able to give the speech next to Marijn, and hopefully he can respond also to some of the challenges I put forward to him. Thank you very much.